Chapter 4 starts with a great core case study about protecting sharks. Sharks get a really bad rap, but humans kill 79 to 97 million sharks per year through shark finning, hunting. They get trapped in fishing lines. So we're much more of a threat to them than they are to us. So why should we protect sharks? The case study offers some good reasons. They help to maintain ecosystems. They remove dead and dying fish from an ecosystem. Potential for a lot of medical knowledge. Sharks are not known to get cancer. And then there's the ethical argument too. They're organisms, they have a right to live. So chapter 4 starts off with what is biodiversity and why is it important? So we have this diagram right here, does a nice job of explaining or identifying the 4 major types of biodiversity, which I have on a post-it note over here. So there's genetic biodiversity within a species biodiversity within a community. That's typically what you think of when you think about biodiversity. Ecological biodiversity, so do we have lots of different ecosystems? And then functional biodiversity, are there lots of different processes that are going on? We have another science focus here about insects and some ecosystem services that insects provide. They're responsible for pollination, pest control, soil renewal, so a lot of things that we might not think about, but we know they're very important. And then here we can see ecological biodiversity within biomes. And here's an individual who you may hear about. It's important. E.O. Wilson studies insects and biodiversity, and he's very well known for publishing quite a few books about biodiversity and his research, and also the theory of island biogeography, so how the size and location of islands, which may or may not be actual physical islands, can affect the species diversity. We'll look at that again later on. 4.2, how does the Earth's life change over time? So review of evolution, which I'm hoping you are all familiar with from biology. So evolution by natural selection. Always think which individuals possess the traits that allow them to survive and reproduce, the 2 most important words when we're thinking about natural selection, survive and reproduce. The understanding of natural selection is important for your understanding of both antibiotic resistance and pesticide resistance. So when we get into agriculture in chapter 12, pesticide resistance will become very important to keep in mind. And something else to keep in mind with evolution and the ability to adapt is the reproductive capacity of a population. So that affects how quickly it can adapt to changes in the environment. So populations or species that are slower to adapt are at a greater risk of extinction. 4.3, how do geological processes and climate change affect evolution? So keep in mind, we'll talk more about climate change later on, but Earth's surface has shifted. We've talked about plate tectonics and the convection currents in the mantle that keep the plates moving. So that is important. There have been changes in temperature, ice ages, etc., that have altered biodiversity over Earth's history. And then we get into 4.4, how do speciation, extinction, and human activities affect biodiversity? So again, something you've hopefully talked about in biology. Speciation is the creation of a new species. This happens when there's no gene flow, so there's isolation. It could be geographic isolation or reproductive isolation. Then eventually you get new species that can no longer successfully reproduce. Biological extinction is when an entire species is gone, wiped from the earth, versus local extinction when a species is just no longer in one area. The background extinction rate is about 1 to 5 species lost per every million species. So there's always some extinction going on. Come back to the science focus in a moment. The end of this section addresses that there have been 5 mass extinctions in the past. Many scientists argue that we're currently in the 6th mass extinction, the only one caused by humans because we were not around for the first 5. Also thinking about changing species, artificial selection and crossbreeding have been around since the agricultural revolution began pretty much, and we started domesticating plants and animals. But genetic engineering and GMOs, genetically modified organisms, that's relatively new. So that's another topic that we'll address more when we get to agriculture. Chapter 4, Section 5. What is species diversity and why is it important? Species diversity can be measured in two ways. Species richness, which is the number of different species, and then species evenness. So kind of the comparative number of species. So I have an example here of location A and location B. Okay, they have the same richness. They each have 5 different types of species, but location B has much higher evenness because, comparatively speaking, there's a more even distribution. Here we get species richness on islands, and go back to E.O. Wilson and his theory of island biogeography. Basically, to summarize this, the larger an island is and the closer it is to the mainland, the greater biodiversity will be. And then islands that are further away and smaller will have less biodiversity. Species richness increases productivity. Okay, so there's more biomass when you have greater number of species, and it increases stability. So the entire ecosystem is better able to adapt to changes. And then we get into section 6. What role do species play in an ecosystem? A lot of vocabulary here. So niche or niche, however you want to say it, it's the role of a species in an ecosystem. Generalists have a very broad niche. Specialists have a very narrow niche. Rats are a good example of a generalist species. So species like to avoid overlapping niches. Okay? They want to avoid competition. So specialization allows lots of different species to live in the same habitat. So we can see that in figure 414, a lot of species, similar species, bird species living in one area, but they all have a specific niche within that. Generalist species are more likely to survive changes in the environment because they have a broader source of food and habitat requirements, etc. Specialists are much more likely to be endangered. Good example is a panda, which relies primarily on bamboo. So if something happens to that bamboo, that's a problem for the panda. Invasive species, which we've talked about a little bit already, or sometimes called non-native or even alien species, they can outcompete native species. Usually there's a lack of predators or parasites and natural controls, and they can be introduced accidentally or deliberately. Indicator species act as, you might have heard of the canary in the coal mine, which coal miners used to bring a canary with them, and basically if there was a toxic gas, the canary would pass out. I'm not sure if it would pass out or die, but they knew there was a problem. The canary would react before they would. So it was a indication, get out of here. So indicator species, their decline acts as early warning signals of damage to that community or ecosystem. Birds and amphibians are good examples of indicator species. So in here we have an example with amphibians as indicator species. So whatever is affecting them may affect other species as well. So a lot of these different factors right here, definitely read through these bullet points. They're going to come up repeatedly in the course. Then we have keystone species. So keystone species have a much greater effect on the other species in an ecosystem or community than their abundance would suggest. So they help to maintain species diversity in an ecosystem. So you can say they help to maintain niche diversity in an ecosystem. So alligators are a good example of a keystone species. The textbook refers to foundation species and uses beavers as an example, but you could probably lump these in with keystone species because they're really changing the ecosystem itself and the environment. So I have not seen foundation species on the AP exam. The 2017 FRQ referenced beavers as a keystone species. Your textbook refers to them as foundation species. So we'll focus more on keystone species. And that's pretty much chapter 4 in a nutshell.